Imagine this. Your period is late, really late. You take a test, and there it is. Pregnant. But this wasn't planned. Not now, not like this. Your hands are shaking as you call your partner, trying to figure out how to even say the words. Or maybe you're on the other side of that call. Your phone rings, you pick up, and the person you love tells you they're pregnant. And neither of you saw this coming, because neither of you really planned for it. You didn't talk about protection. You didn't know what actually works and what doesn't. You just hoped. Here's the strange part. This exact panic, this exact scramble, humans have been having this moment for hundreds of thousands of years. Long before pharmacies, long before pills, long before anyone had ever heard the word contraception. So how did people back then, with none of our science, none of our technology, actually try to stop a pregnancy from happening? The answer is stranger, smarter, and sometimes far riskier than you'd expect. So, what did ancient humans actually do when they didn't want a baby? Let's start with the women, because most of the historical record, as messy and incomplete as it is, comes from what ancient women were doing to control their own bodies. One of the most famous methods comes from ancient Egypt. In documents like the Kahun Papyrus, dated to around 1800 BCE, and later, the Ebers Papyrus, physicians described mixtures women could use before sex to prevent pregnancy. One recipe called for crocodile dung, mixed with fermented dough, inserted as a kind of barrier. It sounds bizarre today, almost comedic, but some researchers studying ancient pharmacology have suggested that the fermented dough may have created a mildly acidic, sticky paste, and acidic environments can be unfavorable to sperm. Whether this specific recipe was reliably effective is impossible to confirm from the historical record alone, but the underlying chemistry wasn't necessarily random. It hints that ancient Egyptian women may have been observing real patterns, long before anyone understood what sperm even was. But here's a question worth sitting with. How would a civilization figure this out without any science at all? Trial and error, generation after generation. Women were watching, testing, and quietly passing knowledge down through midwives and female relatives, long before it was ever written in any papyrus or scroll. Another Egyptian recipe used honey and acacia gum, sometimes soaked into a piece of soft fabric or a natural sponge and placed internally before intercourse. This one has drawn particular interest from historians of medicine. Acacia gum, when it ferments, can produce lactic acid. And lactic acid does appear as an ingredient in some modern spermicidal formulations. That parallel doesn't prove the ancient version worked anywhere near as reliably as modern spermicide, but it does suggest ancient women weren't guessing entirely at random. They were running the world's longest, most informal experiment, using their own bodies as the lab and generations of observation as their only data. Now let's move to ancient Greece and Rome, where one plant became so central to birth control that its reputation has survived for over 2,000 years, even though the plant itself hasn't. It's called silphium. Curious what a plant has to do with any of this? Stay with me, because this part is almost unbelievable. Silphium grew along a narrow strip of coastline in what is now Libya, and ancient sources describe it as being used both as a seasoning and as birth control. Soranus of Ephesus, a physician writing in the 2nd century CE, documented plant-based methods women used to prevent conception, and silphium sat at the center of that reputation. It was so valuable that it appeared stamped on Roman coins from the region of Cyrene. By around the 1st century CE, ancient writers were already describing it as rare or extinct. Some historians have suggested that heavy demand, including demand tied to its reputation as birth control, may have contributed to its overharvesting, since it reportedly couldn't be successfully cultivated outside its native soil. But the exact cause of its disappearance remains uncertain, and historians still debate how much of the story is fact versus ancient legend. Still, even as a partly unproven theory, it's a striking idea that a plant may have vanished from the earth, partly because of how badly people wanted control over pregnancy. When silphium disappeared, Other plants stepped in to take its place in folk medicine. Pennyroyal, a mint family herb, was used across the ancient Mediterranean. Queen Anne's lace, also known as wild carrot, was documented in various ancient and later folk traditions as something women would consume, particularly the seeds, in hopes of preventing or ending an early pregnancy. Some of these plants contained compounds that genuinely could affect the body in that way, but often at doses dangerously close to what could poison the person taking them. This wasn't a safe science. It was medicine practiced on the edge of survival. So if the women were doing all of this, what were the men doing? This is where the historical record gets thinner, but not empty. The oldest and simplest method men used is one you've almost certainly heard of: withdrawal, or what's sometimes called coitus interruptus. It's mentioned in some of the oldest surviving religious and legal texts in human history, which tells us the practice is genuinely ancient. Historians can't say for certain exactly how far back it goes beyond written record, but many consider it plausible that some form of it existed for as long as humans have understood the basic link between sex and pregnancy. It required no tools, no plants, no preparation, just timing and self-control, which made it wildly accessible and also, by most historical accounts, wildly unreliable. Barrier methods for men existed too, though evidence for their use specifically as contraception, rather than protection or ritual, is much murkier. Some historians point to depictions in ancient Egyptian art showing men wearing sheaths, though most researchers believe these were more likely tied to status, ritual, or protection from insects and irritation, rather than pregnancy prevention specifically. It's a great example of how easy it is to misread ancient evidence when we look at it through a modern lens. Just because something looks familiar to us doesn't mean it served the same purpose thousands of years ago. There's also a quieter, often overlooked piece of this puzzle: communication and mutual understanding between partners. Historians who study ancient family structures point out that in many early agricultural and hunter-gatherer societies, couples had a shared practical understanding of when pregnancy was more or less likely, even without formal medical knowledge. It wasn't romantic guesswork. It was survival-driven teamwork, because in most ancient economies, every additional child meant more mouths to feed and more strain on limited resources. Controlling family size wasn't just a personal decision back then. It was often tied directly to whether the entire family survived a hard winter or a poor harvest. Here's something that might surprise you. Some ancient birth control had almost nothing to do with plants, tools, or timing at all. Some ancient cultures relied heavily on breastfeeding as a natural, if unreliable, form of spacing pregnancies. Extended, frequent nursing can suppress ovulation in some women for a period of time after childbirth. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies today, used as a comparative window into ancient life, have found that prolonged breastfeeding appears to play a meaningful role in naturally spacing births in some of these populations. In certain study groups, researchers have documented gaps of several years between children, though this likely varied widely across different ancient cultures and environments, and can't be assumed to have worked the same way everywhere. Timing-based awareness existed too, in a much cruder form than the calendar methods we know today. Some ancient physicians, including Soranus, wrote about tracking a woman's cycle to identify times considered safer for intercourse, although ancient understanding of ovulation was often inaccurate, sometimes even backwards compared to what we now know is biologically true. People were trying to read their own bodies with the only tool they had: careful, patient observation, passed down and refined over centuries, even without understanding the underlying biology. And this raises the real question behind everything we've just covered. How much of this actually worked? Honestly, unevenly. Some methods, like the acidic barrier pastes, likely had real measurable effectiveness. Others, like certain herbal concoctions, ranged from mildly effective to genuinely dangerous, occasionally harming the very people who were trying to protect themselves. But what's remarkable isn't just whether ancient contraception worked, it's that it existed at all. That across nearly every ancient culture we have records of, from Egypt to Greece to Rome and beyond, People were actively trying to control their reproductive future, using observation, plants, timing, and whatever knowledge they could gather and pass on. It tells us something important. The desire to plan your life, to choose if and when to have children, isn't a modern invention. It's ancient. It's human. People thousands of years ago were asking the exact same question you might be asking right now. Not, how do we prevent this? But, how do we take control of our own future? Now here's my take on all of this. As someone who spends way too much time buried in ancient history for this channel, what strikes me most isn't the crocodile dung or the extinct plant. As wild as those details are, it's the sheer persistence. Generation after generation, with no textbooks, no doctors in the modern sense, no internet to search, does this actually work? People still tried. They observed, they experimented, sometimes at real personal risk, and they passed what they learned down to the next generation, hoping to make things a little safer, a little more predictable. We tend to imagine ancient people as helpless against biology, just letting nature run its course. But the truth is far more human than that. They were problem solvers, just like us, working with the tools they had, and honestly understanding how far we've come, from fermented dough and an extinct plant to modern, safe, reliable options, makes you appreciate just how hard-won that progress really is. If this made you look at modern birth control a little differently, that's exactly the kind of perspective shift this channel is built around. There's a lot more hidden history like this still buried in the past, and we've only just scratched the surface. What ancient survival mystery do you want uncovered next? Drop it in the comments. It might just become the next episode.